Was Leonardo da Vinci against Christianity? This is one of the interesting questions that Dan Brown's famous novel, The Da Vinci Code, brings into imagination of its readers. But before we begin, there is something very important that we need to remember. The Da Vinci Code is a work of fiction. Dan Brown uses historical people, places, paintings, and documents, but the fact that something appears in a historical setting does not automatically make the interpretation historical. So what did the real Da Vinci actually believe? Was Leonardo attacking Christianity? Was he questioning the Bible? Did he believe that the New Testament was simply a human invention? Or was his criticism directed somewhere else? Today, I want to look at some of Leonardo's own writings and see what they actually tell us. There are two quotations in particular that are often brought into this discussion. The first is, "Many have made a trade of delusions and false miracles, deceiving the stupid multitude." And the second, "Blinding ignorance does mislead us, O wretched mortals, open your eyes." These quotations are particularly interesting because they can easily be presented as evidence that Leonardo rejected Christianity. But is that really what Leonardo was saying? Was he talking about the Bible? Was he talking about Jesus? Was he saying that Christianity itself was false? I don't think the evidence allows us to make such a conclusion. In fact, when we look at Leonardo's notebooks more carefully, a different picture begins to emerge. Leonardo was deeply suspicious of ignorance, superstition, fraudulent claims, and people who presented themselves as authorities without sufficient evidence. And this is where his criticism of religion becomes particularly interesting. One of the passages that I find especially important comes under the heading of selling paradise. Leonardo writes, "An infinite number of men will sell publicly and unhindered things of the very highest price without leave from the master of it, while it never was there nor in their power, and human justice will not prevent it." Now think about what Leonardo is saying here. Someone is selling something of the highest possible value. But there is a problem. The thing being sold never belonged to them. It was never within their power. And yet they are allowed to sell it publicly. What is this thing? Paradise. And who is the master of paradise? The answer is simple. It is God. Leonardo's criticism, therefore, seems to be directed towards people who claim authority over something that does not belong to them. They present themselves as custodians of divine things. They speak in the name of God, and ordinary people accept what they say. This is very different from saying that the Bible itself is false. Leonardo's target seems to be the human being who takes something sacred and turns it into a possession, an institution, a business, or a source of authority. And this becomes even clearer when we look at another passage. Leonardo writes, "Many have made a trade of delusions and false miracles, deceiving the stupid multitude." Notice the expression, "made a trade." He's not simply saying that people believe in miracles. He is accusing people of making a livelihood from deception and false miracles. This is an attack on religious exploitation. And we have to remember that Leonardo lived in a world in which religion was deeply embedded in social and political life. Religious authorities could influence what people believed. Religious institutions possessed enormous wealth. Relics, saints, miracles, and other religious practices were part of everyday European life. Leonardo, therefore, seems to be asking a much more fundamental question. What happens when human beings stop questioning because somebody tells them that something is sacred? Once a person says, "This is a miracle," perhaps the ordinary person stops investigating. Once somebody says, "This is the word of God," perhaps questioning becomes dangerous. And this is where Leonardo's second quotation becomes important. "Blinding ignorance does mislead us, O wretched mortals, open your eyes." Open your eyes. This is almost a summary of Leonardo's intellectual attitude. Do not simply accept. Look, observe, investigate, think for yourself. And this attitude was not restricted to religion. Leonardo applied this kind of questioning to almost everything. He investigated anatomy, he investigated water, he investigated flight, he investigated geology, he investigated light and optics. He questioned inherited explanations because he wanted to understand how things actually worked. And this is why I think it is misleading to take his criticism of religious authorities and immediately turn it into rejection of Christianity. Leonardo was not critical of other forms of human knowledge. For example, his notebooks contain criticism of alchemists and people who believed that certain substances could explain the transformation of metals. He could therefore be critical of both religious and non-religious claims when he believed that people were accepting ideas without sufficient investigation. This brings us back to the Da Vinci Code. Dan Brown's novel presents Leonardo as somebody who understood Christianity in a radically different way from the church. And some of the historical quotations used in the novel are genuinely Leonardo's quotations, but the important question is not simply, did Leonardo wrote these words? The question is, what did Leonardo mean by them? And genuine quotation can be placed into a fictional argument and made to support a conclusion that the original writer never intended. And I think this is what happens with Leonardo in the Da Vinci Code. The novel uses Leonardo's criticism of religion to support a much larger argument about Christianity, Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and the origins of the Bible. But Leonardo's own notebooks do not give us a systematic argument saying the Bible is false, nor do they give us a clear statement saying Jesus was not divine. That is an important distinction to make, and Leonardo certainly had criticism of religious institutions, religious authorities, and fraudulent religious practices, but that is not the same thing as rejecting Christianity itself. And there is another passage that I find particularly interesting. Leonardo writes about friars who live through the saints. So this is something very important that I found. Those who are dead will after 1,000 years be those who will give a livelihood to many who are living. This quote comes in Leonardo's notebook. Again, notice the criticism. The saint is dead, but centuries later, people are still making their living through devotion to that saint. Leonardo is pointing towards the economic and institutional dimension of religion. The saint has become a source of livelihood for the living. And then we have selling paradise. People are selling something they never possessed. And false miracles. People are making a trade from things that they claim are supernatural. When you put these passages together, Leonardo's criticism becomes much clearer. His problem is not necessarily the existence of God. His problem is what human beings do when they claim to speak on God's behalf. And perhaps this is where Leonardo becomes philosophically interesting, because his warning does not have to apply only to Christianity. It can apply to religion more broadly. It can apply to Christians, it can apply to Muslims, it can apply to Jews. Wherever a human being says, I alone represent the truth, I alone understand what God really means, you must accept this because I have authority. Leonardo's response might simply be, open your eyes. Think for yourself. Investigate. Do not allow another human being to become the unquestionable owner of truth. And this is where I find the passage about selling paradise particularly powerful, because the problem is not necessarily God. The problem is the person who claims to possess God. The problem is not necessarily revelation. The problem is the human interpreter who turns his interpretation into an unquestionable authority. There is, of course, another historical figure who becomes irrelevant here, Martin Luther. Luther lived at the same time as Leonardo. Leonardo died in 1519, where Luther continued to live until 1546. Luther's famous journey into Italy took place around 1510 to 1511, I guess, when Leonardo was still alive. Luther later became one of the central figures of the Protestant Reformation, and his criticism of aspects of church practice particularly the controversy surrounding indulgences, become enormously influential. There is an interesting parallel here. Leonardo criticized false miracles, religious exploitation, clerical corruption, and the commercialization of paradise. Luther criticizes abuses within the church and eventually challenges the authority and practices of the Catholic establishment. But, and this is extremely important, we have no evidence that Leonardo and Luther ever met. We should therefore not invent a connection between them. The parallel is historical and intellectual, not necessarily personal. And perhaps this brings us back to the original question: was Leonardo da Vinci against Christianity? I would say the evidence does not justify such a simple conclusion. Leonardo was certainly critical. He was critical of friars. He was critical of false miracles. He was indeed critical of religious exploitation. He was critical of people who claimed authority over things that were not theirs. And he repeatedly warned human beings against ignorance. But criticism is not the same thing as unbelief. Leonardo's empirical approach may have led him to question literal explanations of central biblical stories, including the story of Noah's flood. But even there, the issue is not simply the Bible is false. Rather, Leonardo is asking whether a particular account can be explained through natural causes. This is the Leonardo we should be interested in, not the Leonardo invented for us by fiction, not the Leonardo we conveniently proves a modern argument, but the Leonardo who was constantly questioning, Leonardo who wanted human beings to open their eyes. And perhaps this is the most interesting lesson of all. Leonardo may have been warning us not simply against religion, but against something much more universal. The danger of allowing other human being to think for us, whether that person is a priest, a scholar, a scientist, a politician, or even a famous author telling us that Leonardo believed, or what Leonardo believed. Perhaps Leonardo's message was much simpler. Open your eyes. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.